What's up and welcome back. I'm John Stark, back from MovieGuide.com, your favorite blind film critic. And today, I'm going to talk about Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Fowl. This is on Netflix. I know you're like, well, isn't this a 2020? No, it's actually, they had a qualifying run so they could get nominated for the Oscars, and then they did it like a couple weeks. Every single Netflix movie that you've seen this year has had like a slight theatrical run, and then like a couple weeks later dropped on Netflix. And that's sort of the thing about Wallace, is that right around Christmas time, this dropped in an insignificant amount of theaters, but just enough to qualify for the Oscars, and is now on Netflix just right after January 1st, so January 3rd. This was sort of the same release strategy that they did for The Pale Blue Eye a couple of years ago. So they always have like a straggler that just bleeds over into the right after the new year. And this year, it's Wallace and Gromit. Should it have been? Well, considering last year around the same time they released Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nugget, and it didn't go on to get an animated feature nomination, maybe they thought by shifting the release back just a slight bit will help Wallace and Gromit out. I just think the fact that it's Wallace and Gromit, not Chicken Run, is probably going to be the thing that helps it out. Because Chicken Run, again, even though it's a sequel to a film that was critically adored, did not have the original star in the voice cast. They did replace him with Zachary Levi, so it does kind of feel like, well, this is a little bit different. So I think some people with Chicken Run were like, do we need a sequel 25? Meanwhile, we've always just been seeing Wallace and Gromit movies like every just so often. They started out as shorts and worked their way into feature. So here's Wallace and Gromit from Aardman. Aardman is back, and they have audio description. And this is great. It's a great representation of audio description because there are so many things in this that, because Gromit doesn't speak, he's very just expressive silently, and he has all these scenes where he has to react or run or chase or drive or fight off or whatever in this movie, and it's all silent. And for a movie like Flow that sort of bathes in its silentness, if you will, to not have audio description is sort of abhorrent to me. And Wallace and Gromit shows that you can have those silent moments are brought out rather well and highlighted perfectly through the audio description track here. The problem is I'm just never really been a fan of Wallace and Gromit. Like, I thought it was fine, but it just I've never really understood Wallace and Gromit and the humor. But the one thing that I would say is, as somebody who enjoys stop motion and claymation, I've always been impressed by the work that Aardman does, like visually. And now that I'm blind, it's like I try to remind myself of that. Like, I know what Wallace and Gromit look like, but this is one of the things I always talk about with audio description. Is there are a couple things that I wish we could figure out a way how to connect people with in specific visual styles. Certain directors do certain things and they have a very specific visual style. Color grading is never really ever brought up in audio description, but also stop motion as an animation, as a vessel for telling animation is just sort of, it's interesting because it's not something that's really ever broached in like how would we, how do you how do we talk about the wonder of claymation and stop motion animation, and what does it look like? To understand the painstaking, it's almost like everybody has to watch like some sort of feature-length documentary on the process of how this movie got made. But it's so impressive when you realize the work that goes into it. If you know how claymation is made, if you just sit back and you enjoy it as a movie, it doesn't really work as much. The story isn't that interesting. The jokes really aren't that funny, but it's this kind of thing has always just been a visual feast. So there might be a little bit of a disconnect if you're not quite understanding the humor here. It's very sort of silly Feels like Wallace and Gromit have come a long way from their very first short, their very first like Oscar-winning short, and now they're here and they have these gnome bots. That's the plot of this movie. Is that Wallace invents a gnome bot, which is exactly sort of what it sounds like, sort of like a garden gnome that is turned into like a smart uh, home, instead of like a home bot, it's a gnome bot. Um, and it 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 does all the chores that Wallace, wants it to do, and like it like lives to do chores. He basically created a slave, but uh, just in this little gnome bot thing. Uh, but he says he created it for Gromit, and Gromit is sort of like mortified because, uh, I mean, he likes his garden the way he likes his garden, but this gnome has like different ideas of how to garden and just messes up the garden. So Gromit is not a fan of this gnome from the beginning, but then the gnome starts getting attention, even on the news, and Feathers gets word, and Feathers figures out. Feathers is in zoo jail. And figures out a way how to hack the system and turn the gnomes against Wallace and Gromit. I think the tagline for this doesn't make any sense. I swear I've seen the tagline is old new friends, old enemies. That makes no sense. There are no new friends here. It's the same ones, but it's also the same enemy. It's still Feathers, ultimately. Although you could say new enemies because of the gnome bots, but the gnome bots are not. I mean, they play both sides depending on who's controlling them because they are robotic. So it just depends on who's in charge. There really aren't any other characters that are brought out here. There are a whole bunch of like random city folk that none of them have really developed storylines or plots. The only people who have anything to do is the I don't know. It's sheriff is not the right word for the Brits, but sheriff the of and of the town, and his detective, who he's willing to like lock him up, throw away the key. He's hated Wallace and Gromit for years, but she's a little bit more of like an actual detective looking for real clues and trying to solve an actual crime. So those are there are really like only a few characters in here. There's like the gnome bot, which becomes gnome bots. Wallace, Gromit, detective, boss, and Feathers, and that's it. And like just ensemble. Um, so I don't know what friends. I don't know who's old and who's new. But yeah, just didn't really do it for me. As a movie, it's not that it's not bad. I certainly don't want to say it, but I wasn't really excited. Luckily, it's short, and there are long credits on this. This movie has like a 1 hour 22 minute runtime, and there are like 10 minutes of credits on it. So it is a breeze, a breeze. When you start off as something that is actually inherently perfect for short form, and then you move it into feature length, I guess they're not really worried about like, oh, we gotta hit this 2 hour mark. They don't even come close. They didn't even hit a 90 minute mark. And if they didn't have really long credits, like this movie would have a really sad runtime. But this movie's really logistically about an hour 10, hour 12 minutes long. So it's a breeze. Your kids will probably find it cute. This is one of the reasons why I think I've mentioned sort of like in an Oscar prediction video. I was talking about the animated feature and somewhere recently, and I said basically you have three locks. You know that it's going to be Wild Robot, Inside Out 2, and Flow. They're getting in no matter what. Those are locks. Now, the safe bet might be to go with the two critically acclaimed Memoir of a Snail and Wallace and Gromit, but there's Moana 2, and could Moana 2 knock out one of the other two? There are reasons to believe it could. So, that's the wild card. So, yeah, do I think Moana 2 could knock out Wallace and Gromit? Sure. They did nominate Chicken Run last year, so it's possible that the Oscars, the new voting body, doesn't have the same sort of sentimentality around Aardman anymore, and something like this just doesn't really click with them in the same way. It's not like every single stop motion animation film or claymation film has like consistently gets nominations. Plus, when they're offered the opportunity to nominate Memoir of a Snail, which is stop motion, then it's almost like it's like giving them permission to not vote for the one they don't like, and instead Moana 2, if they if they so choose. Or there will be people who vote for Transformers 1 and some other films that'll fill their ballot. But I think those are the two that are vulnerable and could be overtaken, most likely by Moana 2. So this is fine. Your kids will like it. And honestly, I always say my bias. I'm never going to try to be like, well, I walked into this with high hopes of of being a huge Wallace and Gromit fan for years and years. Honestly, I've never really been a Wallace and Gromit fan. I'm a fan of Aardman and the art that they create, but I think my favorite movie that they've ever done was Shaun the Sheep. So, yeah, I wasn't even a big fan of Chicken Run back in 2000 when that first came out. I was just like, I don't know. But it's funny when you essentially kind of take away the dialogue, the writing of it, and it's just, which was kind of like Shaun the Sheep ends up becoming almost like a silent movie. You can just sort of appreciate the craft and the storytelling without having to add dialogue to it. So, yeah, I'm not super high on Wallace and Gromit, but I'm not going to go too low because I'm aware of some other films that I graded this year. They were all sort of around the same level. So because I gave like Thelma the Unicorn a B-, I can't really go any lower than this. I should think about things like broader scale that's hard to remember, like the thousands of movies that I've seen over my lifetime and like grades that I have never given them because I wasn't reviewing films. So it's easier to think about what else did I competitively grade this year that was in the same thing. And I certainly wouldn't put this below Thelma the Unicorn, so I'm not going to. So Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul, gets a B-, which is the same grade I gave that and Ultraman and Kung Fu Panda 4 and a couple of other animated films. Have all been about B- films for me. Films that were fine. So that's the way I can describe this. So, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the other side.